Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding. His church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to the Q Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, the founder of Q, and we're excited that you're with us today. And I've got with me Preston Sprinkle. Preston, welcome.
It's good to be back, Gabe. Thanks for having me.
Preston's the author of a book called People to Be Loved, Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue. And Preston, it's obvious as we delve into this a little bit further on this episode that the topic we're talking about is difficult. This is not an easy thing to discuss, especially in public.
Well, it's going to get even more difficult today. We're going to dig into some really nitty-gritty, in-depth questions about what does the Bible actually say about this topic that affects, as we said in the last episode, that affects people directly and deeply.
And so if you feel like you're entering into a conversation that already started, it did already start. It would be really helpful to hear episode 1 and then pick right back up here. If you're joining us again, thanks for listening in on that beginning of this conversation. And, you know, we're doing this podcast because it's just part of Q. I mean, the whole point of Q is to help equip Christians to engage our cultural moment. And you can't engage our current moment as a Christian and not know how to think well about this and know how to speak well about this topic of sexuality. And part of how we're going to engage this is to talk about the sexuality conversation in this framework where we understand theology, we understand ministry, we talk through how to handle our relationships, how do we engage politics, and finally, how do we interact in the public square?
What I love about this framework is that it helps people see that it's not just theology that we're talking about. There's different categories within this discussion. There is theology, and obviously that's foundational, but even Christians that agree on the theological questions may have disagreements about the public square or relationships or ministry. And so I love how we're dividing these different episodes so that we can look at each category on its own terms.
So before we dig into some of the very specific questions around the theology of sexuality, it's helpful to understand how theology really impacts how we live and the choices that we're going to make. And it's helpful to see which of these values we're living by are Christian and which ones of these are being influenced by the world. Tim Keller, pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City, shed some light on this.
Western culture believes that as long as you are absolutely free to live any way that expresses who you are, as long as you don't harm others, everyone is equally free, that would lead to human flourishing. Christians have a very different view, though. One is we have a different view of freedom. We don't think freedom is ever just the absence of all restrictions. It's finding the restrictions that honor your nature and design. So I'm in my 60s. If I feel free to eat fatty foods, I'll probably have terrible health problems and die young.
Let's pause for a second because what he just described, that's the dominant cultural value, Preston, and it actually sounds pretty appealing.
Yeah, and this is why theology is so important, because what he says is, from a secular standpoint, people go to themselves to say what makes me most flourish, but as Christians, we need to say, what does God say about human flourishing?
All right, so he continues.
Therefore, if you restrict your freedom and not eat anything you want, but you eat that which honors your physical nature, not violate your physical nature, you'll have the freedom of greater health and longer life. In the same way, see, Christians then think that we are built to love and know God. That's what we're built for. That's our nature. To center our lives on Him rather than any other created thing and to follow His Word. And His Word, the Bible, is more like an owner's manual now. It's how we're built to function and flourish. And therefore, we believe if you restrict your freedom and give yourself to following Him, knowing Him, and obeying Him, that will lead to human flourishing.
So here's where we're going on this episode. We're going to answer some of these difficult questions around theology. Questions like, are the Old Testament commands, like in Leviticus, are those still relevant? What did Jesus have to say about this topic of sexuality? Does Paul's words, do they still apply today that we see in Romans? How about consensual relationships? When the Bible prohibits same-sex relationship, does it apply to what we see today with consensual monogamous relationships? And finally, is it possible that we're getting this wrong? Like some would say the church was wrong on women and slavery. Preston, these are the tough topics that many Christians are struggling to know how to discuss. And you're a theologian.
Yeah.
I mean, you study the New Testament. This is your space. Yeah. Like, how can we start to approach this right now?
I think it's important to understand, first of all, that we're not going to cover everything. I mean, we could sit here literally for 3, 4, 5 hours and cover more and more questions. So what we want to do is look at some of the main arguments for or and against each position. And there's a big debate about how we even describe these different positions. And I think the best terms are the historic view, which represents the historic Christian sexual ethic, which says that sex belongs within the covenant of marriage between a man and a woman. And then there's the affirming view, which is become... it's growing in popularity even among some evangelicals, and it says that yes, promiscuity of all sorts is wrong, but if a same-sex couple engages in a monogamous, consensual, faithful relationship, then the Bible's not actually prohibiting that.
Yeah, and so the affirming argument is the one that you're hearing more about probably in the last couple of years within Christian circles, evangelical circles. And the historic view is the one that we've just held, that Christians throughout 2,000 years of history and even the Jewish community before then have held on to and have believed leads to human flourishing. So Preston, as we get into this first question, is the Old Testament relevant today? Does what the prohibitions in Leviticus described, many would say, why are we even talking about that? Yeah. That's old news. Yeah. What would you say to that?
It is relevant, but we have to, first of all, understand that the Old Testament has been misused. For instance, with the whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where we see a couple of visitors come into the city of Sodom, and the entire city gathers around and tries to gang rape these two guests. And some people have therefore said this passage condemns homosexuality, but man, this is talking about gang rape. Yeah. And I don't know anybody today marching in gang rape pride parades. Like they're talking about consensual relationships and loving relationships. And so I think that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not a good text to use from the Old Testament to try to apply it to what people are arguing for today. But
and people do use that all the time.
Oh, yeah.
I know growing up that was the main argument, was we're basically like Sodom and Gomorrah if we embrace homosexuality. Right. And to your point, sexual violence seems to be what's happening there as part
attempted
of
sexual violence. They didn't even happen.
But talk about like Leviticus, for example, because this seems to be the one of the verses that's used a lot, Leviticus 18:22 and some others that talk about homosexuality specifically.
Leviticus 18:22 and also 20:13 are two commands in the Old Testament that forbid male same-sex sexual relations. Now, some people want to write these off because they occur in Leviticus, and therefore, since we don't obey other Levitical laws, therefore we don't need to obey these. There's really 3 reasons why I do believe that these commands do apply to Christians today. Number 1, these laws against same-sex relations occur in the context of other laws about sexual immorality that we all follow today. Every Christian is going to look at these other laws that have to do with incest and adultery and other sexual commands that we do obey today. That's the context in which these same-sex laws occur. Number 2, it's true that some things in Leviticus we don't obey today, but we have clear New Testament evidence or clear New Testament direction.
Like not eating shellfish, for example.
Exactly, yeah. Acts 15 and Mark 7 and other passages show that these Old Testament dietary laws don't apply to Christians under the New Covenant. And number 3, it's interesting in 1 Corinthians 6, where Paul's talking about sexual immorality, he uses a word, in the Greek it's arsenokoites, and this Greek word, which refers to same-sex relations, it links back to these same-sex laws in Leviticus 18 and 20. So Paul, it seems that he's reading these laws, which some people, again, are going to say, oh, those are in Leviticus, they're not for today. Paul reads these commands, and he uses a word derived from those passages to say that same-sex relations are wrong.
And when you reference, some people would dismiss those laws, you're referring to what we described earlier, the affirming kind of this new argument that's saying we can do away with the way Christians have thought about this throughout the ages. There's a new way to think about it, and they would dismiss it.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And so I think part of, as a theologian, what I appreciate is part of what you're trying to do is look at the whole of Scripture and say, where's their consistency? And it's not just picking from one place in Scripture, but kind of looking throughout Scripture, which brings us to the next big question that I think people have, which is, what did Jesus have to say about this? Did he ever mention sexuality? Did he mention homosexuality? Would he have even known like what we're talking about today when we're having this conversation? And so I want to discuss that a little bit so that people can appreciate what Jesus did or didn't say. So did Jesus talk about this?
So Jesus never explicitly mentions homosexuality. That's something that's very clear. It's not debated. But he did mention a word that referred to sexual immorality in very general terms. The Greek word is porneia. Now, Scot McKnight, he's a biblical scholar and has been studying the New Testament, especially the life of Jesus, for a couple decades at least, and he's got some really good things to say about this word and how it relates to this discussion.
So, when I see the word porneia, sexual immorality, by Jesus in Matthew chapter 5, in the heart of the first chapter of the Sermon on the Mount, and I ask a question of a Jew, what would a Jew have meant by and understood the word porneia, I am convinced that it entailed prohibition of same-sex relations, because I think, to use a modern analogy, if you double-click on the word porneia, it takes you to Leviticus chapter 18.
I love that Scott reminds us that Jesus was a Jew. He wasn't coming at this question from a modern 21st century perspective. He was coming at it from a Jewish perspective. Now, the Jewish world that Jesus lived in unanimously believed that same-sex relations were wrong. Now, I think that's important because the Jews debated all kinds of stuff, right? You know about the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes, and you have these, you see within the Bible itself, debates among Jews about pretty much everything. The one thing they were in total agreement on was that same-sex relations were wrong. And so the fact that Jesus doesn't explicitly mention, I think, is just due to the fact that he didn't need to. No Jew was debating whether it was right or not.
And alongside this question about did Jesus say anything, in Matthew 19, he does answer this question from Pharisees who are basically asking him what to do about divorce and whether the divorce laws of Moses still applies. And it is an interesting passage. I think it's worth reading.
Matthew 19 is super important because, as he said, he is talking about divorce. But when he's addressing the divorce question, he quotes from Genesis 1 and 2. He says, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And then he quotes from Genesis 2 and says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Here's the interesting thing. When he's addressing the divorce question, all he needs to do is quote Genesis 2, which says, the two shall become one flesh. It's interesting that Jesus goes out of his way to reach back all the way to Genesis 1 to highlight that marriage is between male and female.
Yeah, it's like he uses this moment to reteach, to say, instead of just, like you said, acknowledging, divorce is something you can have because of the hardness of your heart, right? But it's not the way the Creator created it. No, he goes back, he responds almost the way Tim Keller earlier in this episode was saying, like, the Bible gives us the rules for how human beings flourish. It's like a guidebook. It's like Jesus is using it that way. He says, have you not read Genesis 1 and 2? It actually tells you marriage was created to be between a man and a woman.
And he goes past, the Levitical code, he goes all the way back to the design of creation. This is the way the Creator has designed humans to behave sexually with each other.
So we've discussed a little bit about the Old Testament, also what Jesus had to say about this. And now for our third question of the 5 we're going to tackle on this podcast, it's a question of Paul and Romans 1, which I think people widely know Romans 1 speaks negatively about same-sex relationships, but there still seems to be questions about whether Paul really was addressing what we're dealing with today. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about how to think about Romans.
Yeah, that's the argument from affirming scholars and people who say that, we know Romans 1 says negative things about same-sex relations, but the type of relations that Paul had in mind are not the same type of relations that we're talking about today, is how the argument goes. Today we're talking about consensual, monogamous same-sex relations, but back then, the only type of same-sex relations that existed were relationships that were exploitative, like an older man on a younger boy, or a master having sexual relations with a male slave. And it's true that those did exist back then, but I don't think we can limit Paul's words to those specific kind of exploitative type relations.
And I just want to read Romans 1, and I want you to respond to it. Romans 1:26. It says, "For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women, and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men, and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error."
It seems really clear when you read it, right? I mean, it seems like Paul is saying that same-sex relations are not okay. And again, Paul's a Jew writing in a context where within the Judeo-Christian, context, nobody was advocating for same-sex relations.
And it's still consistent with what we talked about in Leviticus,
exactly.
What Jesus' words referred to, and now Paul's, falling in that same vein.
But let's consider this other argument that's been given by affirming scholars and writers. And this argument says that Paul's words, yes, they're negative about a certain type of homosexuality, but in Paul's world, the only type of homosexuality that existed was between two unequal partners, like a master and a slave, or it was an abusive relationship between an older man and a younger boy.
Yeah, it was like there were power dynamics.
Exactly.
One person was being exploited by another. It wasn't these consensual, mutual relationships,
right.
They would say.
So the counter argument is Paul was not aware of consensual, monogamous, faithful, gay people getting married. Let me give you 4 reasons why I think that argument, while yes, we should consider it and wrestle with it, I don't think it really captures what Paul's saying. Number one, I've heard some people say that in Paul's world, consensual same-sex relations simply didn't exist. That's not true. Now, it is true that they were more rare, that most of the same-sex relations were between an older man and a boy, master and a slave, but we do see historical evidence that there were these relationships where consensual adults were in a same-sex relationship. In fact, there's a couple scholars who are actually affirming. They actually think that consensual monogamous same-sex relations are okay. And even these 2 scholars, Bernadette Bruton, who's a lesbian, and Bill Loader, who is a world-renowned expert on ancient sexuality, and both of these scholars say, you know what, there were consensual relations back then, and Paul's words apply to those. They just think that we need to move beyond Paul and say Paul just needs to kind of get up to speed with our modern day wisdom and science and so on.
Yeah, and sometimes those scholars you're mentioning get frustrated with Christians who are trying to say consensual relationships didn't exist, because it actually counters their argument that no, this has always been, this is natural, this is all part of culture. But go on, point 2.
So point 2 is in verse 26, Paul prohibits female same-sex relations. Now, and this point really isn't disputed among all historians, is that when it comes to female same-sex relations in the ancient world, those were consensual. Like, we don't see a female having sexual relations with another female slave, or an older female and a younger female girl. Like, the female same-sex relations that existed in the ancient world were consensual, adult consenting relations. And so when Paul says those are wrong, and then he compares it to the male same-sex relations, it doesn't make any sense to say that these should be limited to exploitative relationships. Number 3, if you look at Paul's language carefully, he uses language of what I call language of mutuality. They burned with passion for one another, and they received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Now, If it was somebody exploiting somebody else, let's just say rape, or a man with a boy, the victim, the boy, wouldn't be blamed. He wouldn't be included in this kind of one another language of mutuality. And fourth, Paul uses this word, in some translations, it's unnatural or against nature. Paul says that these same-sex relations were against nature. That was a very common phrase used in and around the first century among people in the Greco-Roman culture, Stoics and other moral philosophers. They use the same word to condemn same-sex relations on the grounds that two people of the same sex should not be having sexual relations. So if we just step back and look at what Paul's actual words and look at the historical context, we cannot say that Paul's words are limited to an exploitative type of relations. His words clearly apply to all types of same-sex relations.
Our fourth question, which is one I know many in our culture have who aren't Christians for the church, they just can't quite get their head around how this could be wrong. But I think even some Christians are wondering themselves, is the question of this, like if two consenting same-sex adults love each other, why can't they get married? And
they're not hurting anybody, right? That's how the argument goes. But remember, we saw from Matthew 19 that when Jesus talks about marriage, he doesn't just say it's two consenting adults. He says marriage is between male and female.
Yeah, and Wes Hill, who is a professor of biblical studies at Trinity School in Pennsylvania, but he self-identifies as gay. He lives a celibate life. He's a theologian. He wrote a book called Washed in Waiting, who's decided to live by a sexual ethic that says, I'm not going to have a same-sex marriage, even though some would argue that he could. Here's what Wes has to say about this.
By starting with Christ, starting with a hermeneutic that says the Bible coheres around Christ. And, I think what you find is interesting. Jesus, when he's asked about marriage, he goes back and he fuses together parts of Genesis 1 and parts of Genesis 2. And he highlights the text in Genesis 1, where it says that God made humanity as male and female to be in his image. And then he links that up with Genesis 2 and says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And that whole thing is linked to the blessing of new life being passed on. I mean, Genesis 1 mentions that male and female come together and they bear children. And, the book of Genesis goes on and it has a genealogy. And I think Jesus, when he's asked about divorce, he goes back to those kind of foundational texts and he reads them, he interprets them. And so for me, to ask about a Christian view of marriage is to ask about that. It's to notice that Jesus is doing that when he's describing what marriage is.
Now, the fifth question we're going to talk about on this podcast episode is the one that I think most people are feeling when they get deep into this discussion. They quickly hear pushback, and they go, if you hold to this historic position, you're probably on the wrong side of history, just like the church in the past has been. Because didn't we use the Bible to defend slavery? Didn't we use the Bible to defend women, like not having liberation? And so the patriarchal models of the old days just don't hold today, and you're probably getting this one wrong if you're holding to this commitment. And one day you'll wake up and realize maybe 30 years late that you missed it.
Yeah, and the church has been wrong on some of these issues, right? I mean, it's just because the church has always held to something doesn't mean it's right to continue to hold to that. But with the slavery question in particular, people say, since the church believes slavery was fine for so many years, maybe homosexuality is also like that. But the comparison, it's not exact. It's not the same.
It's pretty thin when you. I think when you go deeper into like how did we historically as a church think about slavery? I mean, you understand the New Testament, obviously. Talk a little bit about slavery and how that showed up in the Bible.
So it's true that the New Testament does not come out and condemn the institution of slavery, but what it does do is it kind of guts it from the inside out. I mean, you have masters and slaves being called equals, and that's just revolutionary in the first century. And even books like Philemon and others where Paul, he's moving towards liberation. He's not endorsing the sort of slavery paradigm that we see in the Roman world.
Yeah, it was a subversive way of doing it, and it slowly over time kind of broke down the institution of slavery so that, just 2 centuries ago you have Wilberforce as a Christian abolitionist saying we can't uphold this institution anymore in our society.
Right. And even before Wilberforce, we have Thomas Aquinas, this towering theologian who called slavery sin. And there was actually many other popes and Christian leaders who actually condemned slavery. And even Rodney Stark, who's a sociologist, says, the problem wasn't that the church didn't speak out against it. The problem is that nobody listened. And so you have people that still did, enslave people, but there were many voices in the church that condemned it. But going back to the comparison, we don't see the same thing with homosexuality. In the 2,000 years of church history, every single church leader, person in the church believed that it was wrong, and the same can't be said of slavery.
Well, and on women, just to touch on that for a second, Jesus is very progressive, it seems, culturally in how he treats women. You see even in the New Testament, there's women leaders that are part of the church that Paul is writing letters to and addressing. I think in general, when you look at Scripture and you start in Genesis to Revelation, it's helped me to see it this way, that the scriptural narrative tends to grow more liberating on this topic of women, on the topic of slavery. But when you look at sexuality, it's not growing more liberating at all. In fact, it just gets more clearer that this is how it is.
There's no trajectory towards changing the old perspective.
If anything, it just continues to show that there is a constraint here around sexuality that will be maintained, and it goes, as we talked about earlier, from Leviticus through Jesus all the way into Paul and into the letters, where you just see sexual immorality is categorized as something that's just never going to be justified. It's never going to be something that's affirmed. But I think the challenge for young people that you and I feel too, Preston, just in our generation, right? It's just not cool to hold on right now to the historic position.
Right.
And I think what you and I feel is that it is hard socially to convey the historic position right now. And I know that's what I believe, not because it's something my parents taught me or I learned in church as a Christian or any Christian would have learned over the last couple thousand years, but that specifically trying to go back into this and relearn and readdress it and look at the toughest questions, it's become even clearer to me that this is what Christians believe for a reason.
Right. And if I can speak for you, I know I can speak for me, saying I'm not afraid to change my view on something that I grew up with. It's not like I inherited this view and all I'm going to do is defend it. Like both of us have in the last 20 years or so, said, you know what, this traditional belief that I grew up with, it's actually wrong. But when we've looked at all the evidence for the historic Christian position on same-sex relations, it's not just the traditional view. It is the view that is most faithful to the scriptural and theological witness.
And young people, though, especially, I think, are feeling the peer pressure.
Yeah.
And it's not a bad thing that they're pro-justice, that they're for equality, that they want human rights to be something everybody experiences. They don't want to hold something back from their friend or neighbor that they feel like they're having access to as relates to the marriage discussion and so many other things. And so I think we have this dilemma now. And you have some leaders in the Christian church who've started to shift their opinions and really change their theology from this 2,000 years of history. And one of those friends of mine is a personal friend, somebody I care a lot about, respect a lot, a guy named David Gushee. He's an ethicist, a scholar, and he wrote a book called Changing Our Minds recently where he really lays out how he has come to change his mind, that he believes that history here that we've just discussed, he has ways to work around that, and that the historic position isn't the only way we should view it. And I want people listening to get to hear his perspective in his words, how he would describe why he doesn't think the historic position is accurate anymore.
What I think we've done here is treat this as a sexual ethics issue. I think that fundamentally the LGBT issue is a love issue, a justice issue, and a sacredness of life issue. When you look at the actual evidence of what historic Christian teaching, not just from jerks, but just in general, what it does to the 16-year-old in the church is it creates a disastrous box out of which they cannot escape with any good options from the church. It's essentially a golden rule issue. I mean, in a sense, what we've done is we've taken the 6 Bible passages that reference same-sex activity, and they have trumped the core teachings of love, justice, and the sacred worth of all people. So we have kids throwing themselves off of bridges because they are in such despair because of what they have been taught and how they have been treated. And we have parents throwing kids out of their home and telling them they're going to hell and never to come back. I've been on the road for 6 months since the book came out. I've met so many people and heard so many stories that everything that I said in the book, I'm even more convinced about. I think what we have here is a toxic body of tradition that bears bad fruit, as Matthew Vines said. And so it has to be reconsidered on the basis of the core moral convictions of the Christian faith. As a pastor, I feel that we deliver harm rather than care to the great majority of LGBT people in our churches and in our families. And so that is my bottom line. It's not my heart got broken and so I lost the ability to think. My heart got broken and so I began to see Scripture through the tears of our own most oppressed group. And so I noticed Scriptures that I had missed, and I can contextualize Scriptures in some different ways. And I kind of think that's the way Jesus handled Scripture and the way Jesus treated people.
Man, when I hear Gushee describe these experiences, my heart just breaks. I mean, what he describes is horrible, and any Christian, any empathetic Christian should be broken over that as well. But the one when I'm hearing him describe the stories, what he's talking about is not something that's intrinsic to the Christian sexual ethic itself. What he's describing is a very unchristian posture, the dehumanization and isolating people and treating them like some subspecies of the human race. But that is not intrinsic to the ethic itself. That is a wrong way of holding on to that ethic. So I don't think the answer is to change the ethic. It is to change the posture.
Yeah, and I guess the argument he would make, and maybe others who would agree and align with the affirming position, is that if the fruit of your ethic is producing this kind of hatred, judgmentalism, condemnation, it's causing people to become victims and to react this way, then you really should question the ethic. And I think it's a valid point to try to make.
Right.
But when we talk through it, I think what's clear is he's not addressing those who've actually had same-sex attraction and grown up in a loving posture type of an environment.
It's fascinating. According to a recent study, most gay and lesbian people that have left the church, they grew up in the church and left the church, most of them did not leave the church over theological reasons. They left the church because of dehumanization. And as I've talked to many gay and lesbian people, that is a consistent theme. I was dehumanized, I was shunned. It wasn't that they were sort of lovingly introduced to this historic ethic relationally with people surrounding them and coming alongside like that. That's most people that grew up in that environment, a very loving environment, they don't leave that. It's the people that grew up in this hateful environment.
Well, and this is the dilemma for us, Preston, is as we go through this series, we're trying to describe how would you hold on to this historic view and yet be loving and kind and compassionate and accepting of people who disagree or who are living differently than you. What does it mean to love as a Christian? Because we know love should be guiding our actions. And I find many people are feeling like, man, these two can't go together. It's like oil and vinegar. You can't hold historic view and love. And the next episode, this is where we're going to go. We're going to talk specifically about relationships. What does it mean to be a parent to a child who just came out to you? What does it mean to be friends with somebody who came out to you, or a spouse who comes out to you? Or what does it mean to have friends who disagree with you theologically and don't hold anymore to the historic position maybe that they once did, and now they've changed? What are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to debate that every time you go out to coffee? Do you just let it go?
Yeah.
These are the dilemmas I think people in real life are dealing with.
And this is where most of the questions come, I think. I mean, I get theological questions and ethical questions, but most of the questions I get are people saying, okay, I maintain the historic view, but I want to be loving. I want to be compassionate. How do I do both?
So we want to hear from you, the listeners. We want to hear your questions. One of the things you're hearing a lot of is Preston and I's opinions and some other voices, but what are your opinions? What do you think about this? What are we missing? Like, what are some of the areas you would push back on or say,
Yeah.
man, you skipped over that one because it was too tough. Ask us those questions because we want to respond. And in the final episode of this series, we're going to actually take on as many of those questions as we can and try to give you the best answers we can or hear from some more experts who can answer those questions. And also, throughout this episode and other episodes, we are referencing research sometimes and certain people's stories and opinions or books, and we want you to have access to that too. So when you go to qideas.org/podcast, you can access the same information. And I do want to continue to plug your book, Preston, People to Be Loved, because it is a resource that really goes even deeper into each one of these questions we've been talking about, and it's done in a posture that really values people and values love.
Yeah, much of what we said, we're assuming a large body of evidence that we're not talking about here because that can get kind of tedious, but much of that is in the book.
So join us for the next episode. Invite your friends into this. Go back and listen to the original ones and join us as we continue to learn more and continue to delve into what does it look like to try to put into practice a theology that right now seems pretty counter to the rest of the world. To hear my full interview with Tim Keller on the homosexuality topic, go to qideas.org/podcast.